Puerto Rico has one of the most distinctive rent regulation frameworks in any U.S. jurisdiction, shaped by the island's unique legal system, economic challenges, and housing market dynamics. If you own rental property in Puerto Rico, the rules here are fundamentally different from the mainland states, and understanding the regulatory landscape is essential for staying compliant. Puerto Rico's legal system is based on civil law, rooted in Spanish legal tradition, rather than the common law system used by 49 of the 50 states. This affects how landlord-tenant relationships are structured, how contracts are interpreted, and how courts evaluate disputes. The primary governing provisions are found in the Puerto Rico Civil Code, along with specific housing legislation that has evolved over decades of legislative activity. Here's the most important thing Puerto Rico landlords need to understand. The island has a history of rent control that is more extensive than almost any U.S. state. Puerto Rico enacted comprehensive rent control legislation decades ago under the Reasonable Rent Act, which established rent ceilings and regulated how much landlords could charge for covered units. While the scope and enforcement of rent control in Puerto Rico has changed significantly over the years, with various amendments, exemptions, and administrative changes, the legacy of rent regulation continues to affect the island's housing market. The current status of rent regulation in Puerto Rico requires careful attention because the framework has been modified multiple times. Certain categories of rental housing may still be subject to rent restrictions depending on when the unit was built, the type of property, and the specific regulatory provisions that apply. Landlords should not assume that all rent regulation has been eliminated. The details matter, and the specific status of your property determines which rules apply. For properties that are not subject to any remaining rent restrictions, which includes most newer construction and many properties that have been deregulated through the legislative process, the landlord can set and adjust rent based on market conditions. However, even for deregulated properties, proper notice and procedural requirements must be followed. For month-to-month tenancies on deregulated properties, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Under Puerto Rico's civil law framework, changes to the terms of a lease require reasonable notice, and for monthly tenancies, this generally means at least 30 days' notice before the increase takes effect. The notice should be in writing, should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term, unless the lease includes a provision allowing mid-term increases. Puerto Rico's Civil Code enforces lease terms as written, so if the lease doesn't include an adjustment mechanism, the landlord must wait until the lease expires to negotiate a new rent. Under the civil law concept of tacit reconduction, which we discussed in our Puerto Rico lease termination video, if the tenant remains after the lease expires and the landlord doesn't object, the lease may be considered renewed. To implement a rent increase at renewal, the landlord should communicate the new terms before the existing lease expires and obtain the tenant's agreement to the new rate. Now let's discuss the restrictions that apply to rent increases in Puerto Rico. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Puerto Rico's legal framework, drawing on both civil law principles and specific statutory provisions, prohibits landlords from raising rent as punishment for a tenant exercising their legal rights. If a tenant makes a complaint about habitability, reports a code violation, or exercises any other legal right, the landlord cannot respond with a retaliatory rent increase. Courts in Puerto Rico evaluate the circumstances of an increase, including the timing, magnitude, and the landlord's treatment of other tenants, when assessing whether the increase was retaliatory. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Puerto Rico has its own anti-discrimination provisions, and the Federal Fair Housing Act applies to the island as it does to all U.S. jurisdictions. Landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or any other protected characteristic. Puerto Rico's specific anti-discrimination statutes may provide additional protections beyond the federal floor. Puerto Rico's economic situation creates unique practical considerations for rent increases. The island has experienced significant economic challenges, including a prolonged fiscal crisis, population decline, and the devastating effects of Hurricanes Maria and Fiona. These factors have created a complex housing market where some areas have strong rental demand, while others face high vacancy rates and declining population. The San Juan metropolitan area, including San Juan, Bayamón, Carolina, Guaynabo, and Caguas, has the island's most active rental market. Demand for quality rental housing in San Juan remains relatively strong, driven by professionals, university students, and the tourism sector. Landlords in the San Juan area generally have more pricing power than those in other parts of the island. The Condado, Isla Verde, and Santurce neighborhoods in San Juan have particularly active rental markets, with rents that are substantially higher than the island average. These areas attract both local professionals and mainland transplants, including individuals who have relocated to Puerto Rico under the island's tax incentive programs. The influx of higher-income residents has pushed rents upward in these desirable neighborhoods, creating tension between market pricing and affordability for long-term residents. Ponce, Mayagüez, and other secondary cities have softer rental markets. Population decline in many parts of Puerto Rico has reduced rental demand, and landlords in these areas may find that aggressive rent increases lead to vacancies that are difficult to fill. Understanding the demographic trends in your specific market is essential for making smart pricing decisions. Hurricane damage and recovery have also shaped the rental market. Many properties were damaged or destroyed by Hurricanes Maria and Fiona, reducing the overall housing supply. At the same time, federal disaster recovery funds have supported rebuilding efforts. The interplay between reduced supply and rebuilding activity has created localized market dynamics that vary from one community to another. One important consideration for Puerto Rico landlords is the island's unique tax environment. Puerto Rico's Act 60, formerly Acts 20 and 22, provides significant tax incentives for individuals and businesses that relocate to the island. This has brought a wave of mainland residents to Puerto Rico, particularly to the San Juan area, and has increased demand for quality rental housing in desirable locations. Landlords who cater to this demographic can command premium rents, but they should also understand that this population may be more mobile and price-sensitive than long-term local residents. Puerto Rico also has specific regulations regarding public housing and subsidized housing that affect a significant portion of the island's rental market. The Puerto Rico Public Housing Administration oversees public housing on the island, and federal programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program are administered through local authorities. For tenants receiving housing assistance, rent increases must be approved by the administering authority and must fall within the established fair market rent guidelines. One best practice for Puerto Rico landlords, given the complexity of the regulatory framework, verify the specific regulatory status of your property before implementing any rent increase. Determine whether your property is subject to any remaining rent control provisions, whether it has been deregulated, and what specific notice and procedural requirements apply. Consulting with a Puerto Rico real estate attorney who is familiar with the island's housing regulations is strongly recommended, particularly for older properties that may have a complex regulatory history. Another best practice: communicate rent increases in the context of the value you're providing and the market conditions that support the change. Puerto Rico tenants are generally well informed about their rights, and a professional, transparent approach to rent increases builds trust and reduces resistance. Provide the notice in writing, in Spanish, which is the primary language of most Puerto Rico tenants, and include a clear explanation of the new terms. For landlords who own properties in areas affected by hurricane damage, be sensitive to the ongoing recovery challenges that tenants face. While market conditions may support rent increases in some areas, Implementing large increases in communities that are still recovering from disaster damage can create both legal and reputational risks. Courts and regulatory bodies may be particularly sympathetic to tenants in disaster-affected communities, and increases that appear to exploit vulnerable populations can attract negative attention. Puerto Rico's security deposit rules are governed by the Civil Code and specific housing legislation. The landlord must return the security deposit within a reasonable time after the tenant vacates, along with an itemization of any deductions. While these rules don't directly regulate rent increases, landlords should understand that increasing rent does not automatically entitle them to collect additional security deposit from an existing tenant without a new agreement. One more practical consideration. Puerto Rico's court system operates in Spanish, and legal proceedings follow civil law procedures rather than common law procedures. Landlords who are not fluent in Spanish or not familiar with civil law practice should work with local legal counsel for any matters that involve court proceedings or regulatory compliance. The procedural differences between Puerto Rico's legal system and the mainland common law system are substantial, and assumptions based on mainland experience can lead to costly mistakes. For the complete guide to Puerto Rico rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every jurisdiction in our Landlord Tenant Law series.